Most analysts on television are not going to tell you what I am about to tell you, not because they don't know it, but because the moment you stop asking who is winning between Russia and Ukraine and start asking who is winning because of this war, the entire story you have been watching for 4 years falls apart. When you turn on the news and see the maps of eastern Ukraine, the trench lines, the drone footage, the casualty counts, the natural assumption is that this is a war between two countries, Russia versus Ukraine. One side will gain territory, the other side will lose it, and eventually someone walks away with the victory. That picture is wrong. Russia versus Ukraine is the surface of this war. It is not the war itself, the war that will decide the shape of the next 40 years of global power. That war is being fought in a language none of the participants are using out loud. It is being won quietly by a third country that has not fired a single bullet, lost a single soldier, or signed a single treaty. The country that has already won the war in Ukraine is not Russia. It is not Ukraine. It is not the United States. It is not the European Union. The winner has been determined for some time now. The numbers are public. The trade flows are public. The military dependency is public. The diplomatic positioning is public. The only thing missing is the willingness to say the conclusion out loud. So let me say it. The country that is actually winning the war in Ukraine, by every measurable strategic metric that matters, is China. And by the time we are done, you will understand exactly how, exactly why, and exactly who pays the price. What I want to give you is not a list of opinions. It is a framework. 3 mechanisms, 3 layers of one game. By the end of this, you will understand the strategic logic of this conflict better than 99% of the people watching the headlines. Here is the anchor number I want you to hold in your head for the next 20 minutes. 8 times. As of January 2026, China's national wealth is more than 8 times greater than Russia's. 8. That is not a small gap. That is the gap between a junior partner and a senior one. That is the gap that makes one country a client and the other a patron. And every week this war continues, that gap widens because Russia is burning through manpower, equipment, oil revenues, and political capital. China is burning through almost nothing. A war is a budget, a war is an inventory, a war is a clock. Right now, Russia's budget is bleeding. Russia's inventory is depleting. Russia's clock is ticking. China's budget is fine. China's inventory is growing. And China's clock, the one Beijing actually cares about, is being reset on its own terms. Now let me show you exactly how this transaction works. Start from the root cause, because the current event is not the system. The system produced the current event. Before February 2022, Europe was Russia's biggest customer. Russia sold roughly half its oil and most of its gas to European countries. That trade was the spine of the Russian state. It funded the military. It funded the social spending. It funded the Kremlin's room to maneuver on the world stage. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. And inside of 18 months, that customer relationship collapsed. Where did the oil go? Before I answer that, pause. Because the answer is the cleanest example of a 2,500-year-old Chinese strategic doctrine being executed in real time on European soil. Sun Tzu wrote it down before the Roman Empire existed, and what comes next is not a war story. It is the most expensive strategic operation of this century, and you are about to see exactly who is paying for it, and exactly who is collecting. The oil went east, to 2 buyers. Between January and September 2025, according to the International Energy Agency, Beijing accounted for 44% of Russia's oil exports. India accounted for 40%. Together, those 2 countries, neither of them part of the Western sanctions coalition, are now buying the energy that used to keep Europe warm and the Kremlin solvent. But here is what the headline number hides. China is not buying Russian oil at world market price. It is buying at a discount, a widening discount. And every barrel Russia sells to China comes with the implicit message that there are no alternative buyers, no leverage, no second option. As of November 2025, the average price of Urals crude used to calculate Russia's oil and gas revenues was $44.87 per barrel, 16.5% lower than it had been just 1 month earlier. Russia's oil and gas budget revenues for 2026 are projected to come in 1 to 1.2 trillion rubles below the planned level. In January 2026, Russian state revenues from taxing the oil and gas industries fell to 393 billion rubles, the lowest figure since the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic, according to Janis Klug of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. That is not a trade relationship. That is a dependency. Igor Sechin, longtime Putin ally, CEO of Rosneft, one of the most powerful men in Russia, put the logic precisely. He stated publicly that Russia is, in his own words, ready to serve as a resource base for China. That is not language partners use. That is language a junior partner uses when there is nowhere else to go. Hold that thought, because the economic dependency is only the first of 3 threads. The second thread is military. Russia did not just lose its biggest customer, it lost its supply chain. Western components stopped flowing in February 2022. Microchips, machine tools, precision optics, the small expensive things that turn raw steel into a functioning missile. So Russia needed a new supplier. It found one. According to estimates the European Union has shared publicly, China now supplies up to 80% of the critical components used by Russia's defense ministry. 80%. That is not assistance. That is the spine of the Russian war machine running through Chinese factories. There is a name for what this is. Western analysts have settled on a phrase, decisive enabler. NATO members, including the United States, formally identified China as the decisive enabler of Russia's war effort. The United States ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, said it plainly at the Munich Security Conference in February 2026. China, he said, could call Vladimir Putin and end this war tomorrow. That is not the language you use about a neutral bystander. That is the language you use about the country holding the leash. Russia cannot fund this war without selling oil at a discount to China. Russia cannot supply this war without importing components from China. And Russia cannot end this war without permission from China. 3 dependencies, 1 direction. Every week this continues, the dependency hardens. Now connect that to something most people never think to connect. Because what is happening to Russia inside this war is the same thing that has happened to one other major power in the last 100 years. And the parallel will tell you exactly where this story ends and how soon. This is where your wallet enters the story. Because the same currents reshaping the Russia-China relationship are reshaping the world your savings live inside. Start with what this means for Europe. European countries spent the last 40 years building an economic model around cheap Russian energy. That model is now broken. Germany, the industrial engine of the European Union, has been deindustrializing in slow motion since 2022. Energy-intensive manufacturing has been shutting down. Chemical plants have been relocating. Steel mills have been idled. The bill for that adjustment is being paid in higher household electricity prices, lower wages, slower European growth, and all of that travels through the global economy back into your retirement account, your import prices, your mortgage market. Meanwhile, the energy that used to flow west now flows east. Cheap, reliable, on long-term contracts. China is getting the same Russian oil and gas that Europe is paying premium prices to replace from the Persian Gulf and the United States. That is a permanent shift in the cost base of Chinese manufacturing. And cheap energy is the foundation every great industrial power needs to outproduce its rivals. Here is a statistic that will sound impossible. According to the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, China's imports of Russia's Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean crude saw a 14% month-on-month rise in March 2026, the second highest volume since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. China is buying more Russian oil during this war than it was before this war. Sanctions did not isolate Russia from China. Sanctions delivered Russia to China. Now layer in the second mechanism, the redirection of Western attention. For 2 decades before this war, the entire strategic conversation in Washington was about pivoting to Asia. China was the long-term challenge. The Pacific was the future theater. American military planners were building doctrines, alliances, and weapon systems for a Pacific contingency. Then February 2022 happened, and almost overnight, the entire Western attention span snapped back to Europe. Hundreds of billions of dollars in weapons, intelligence, and political capital have flowed into Ukraine. American stockpiles of artillery shells, Patriot interceptors, drones, and electronic warfare equipment have been drawn down faster than the defense industrial base can replenish them. Every Patriot interceptor used to shoot down a drone over Kiev is a Patriot interceptor not available in the Pacific. This affects 2 groups in completely different ways. For Europe, the war means existential urgency, rearmament, fiscal strain, political division. For China, the war means relief. The country Beijing was preparing to confront on the other side of the world is now fighting a slow, expensive, attritional war in Europe, burning through the very weapons stockpiles that would matter most in any Pacific contingency. There is a phrase for this in Chinese strategic thought. It comes from the 36 Stratagems, a compendium of military principles older than most modern nation-states. The phrase translated is, sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight. The idea is simple. When your rivals are exhausting themselves against each other, your job is not to intervene. Your job is to wait, observe, and inherit what is left when the dust settles. That is not a metaphor. That is the operating doctrine. And it is being executed in front of a world that mostly cannot see it, because it is watching the wrong map. The economic thread captures Russia. The attention thread captures the West. And then there is a third thread, the most consequential one, the one almost nobody is connecting. Take a deep breath before I walk you through this next part, because the third thread is not about oil, and it is not about weapons. It is about something Ukraine has built during this war that almost no one outside specialist circles is talking about. And what happens to it next will decide the next 40 years of warfare on this planet. Ukraine has, by accident of necessity, become the world's leading laboratory of modern warfare. In 4 years, under conditions no Western military has faced since the Second World War, Ukrainian engineers have built a drone industry from almost nothing into the largest live combat drone ecosystem on the planet. They have iterated on electronic warfare in real time. They have pioneered fiber optic drones that cannot be jammed by Russian electronic countermeasures. They have integrated artificial intelligence into targeting cycles in ways no peacetime military has been able to replicate. The Ukrainian battlefield is right now the most data-rich combat environment in human history. That knowledge is an asset, and every asset can change hands. The Center for European Policy Analysis published an assessment in late 2025 that put the structural risk in precise language. Russia's drone industry, the assessment found, has been built in considerable measure on Chinese support, including, by their account, the deployment of Chinese engineers at Russian factories. Chinese military officers have toured the front lines to observe drone combat directly. If Ukraine's fractured but highly innovative drone industry were to fall into Russian hands as part of any negotiated settlement, the Chinese would expect to benefit, not as a side effect, as the underlying purpose of the alignment. This is the gap narrative. The official statement from every Western capital is that Ukraine will be supported until victory. The observable reality is that Western weapons stockpiles are being drawn down faster than they can be replaced. The observable reality is that Russian forces have continued to take net territory month by month through 2026, according to Institute for the Study of War data. The observable reality is that Ukraine had lost roughly 30% of its electricity consumption capacity since the start of the invasion as of October 2025, and was operating at about 1/3 of pre-invasion generation by fall 2025. The observable reality is that 61% of Ukrainians in documented polling cited by the Russia Matters project support some form of territorial compromise to end the war. That gap between the announced commitment to total victory and the slow structural exhaustion of every side except one is not a communications failure. It is the strategic signature of a conflict whose real beneficiary is not at the negotiating table. Now, before we go further, something deserves a full stop. By late February 2026, according to estimates shared with the Russia Matters project by a former senior Western official, Russian military casualties had reached 1 million killed and wounded. Ukrainian military casualties had reached 250,000 to 300,000 killed and wounded. Those are not abstract figures. Those are sons, fathers, brothers, daughters. Behind every probability estimate, every strategic projection, every territorial calculation, those numbers sit. Behind every benefit accruing quietly to a third country, those numbers sit. They are the human cost of the strategic transaction being executed. That weight is what makes the rest of this analysis necessary. Not entertainment, not commentary, but the obligation to see what is happening clearly enough that it is not allowed to happen again. And here is the historical parallel that makes the pattern impossible to dismiss. Every student of military history knows what happened to Czechoslovakia in 1938. A small country with a sophisticated arms industry was handed over in the name of peace. 2 years later, many of the tanks that rolled into France were Czech-built. The arms industry of the country sacrificed for stability became the engine of the next war. The strategic principle is unchanged. When a small advanced country falls, even partially, to a larger backwards one, the small country's industrial knowledge becomes the larger country's military upgrade. That is what is at stake in Ukraine's drone industry. And the country positioned to harvest that upgrade through its decisive enabler relationship with Russia is not Russia itself. Tally the position. China gets discounted energy. China gets the West's attention drained from the Pacific. China gets a junior partner, Russia, that owes Beijing for its survival. China gets a Western alliance fractured by the long political bill of a 4-year war. And China gets a potential inheritance of the most advanced drone combat doctrine on Earth, without having sent one soldier to any battlefield. Step back from the specific details for a moment, because everything you have just heard is the architecture of a single conclusion. And the conclusion is the thing the headlines have spent 4 years refusing to print plainly. Russia versus Ukraine was the wrong question from the first week. The right question was always who is sitting on the mountain. What I want you to take from this is not fear. Fear is not useful. Panic is not useful. What is useful is the map. Because when you have the map, you can see what is coming before it happens. And you can position yourself, your family, your investments, and your attention for the world that is actually being built, not the one being announced. Now let me give the counter-argument a fair hearing, because serious people look at everything I have just described and arrive somewhere much calmer. They argue China's dependence on Russia is overstated. They point out that Russia-China trade is dwarfed by China's trade with the United States and the European Union. They note China has its own real problems: a property crisis, demographic decline, slowing growth, capital outflows. They argue a too strong Russia, exhausted but armed and dependent, is also a long-term problem for Beijing, not just a gift. They argue the so-called no-limits partnership has limits, that Russia's relationships with India and the Gulf states mean Russia is not, in fact, fully captured. Those points are not wrong. They are real. And the honest picture, stripped of both panic and complacency, is this: China is not the puppet master. China is the patient gardener. It did not start this war. It did not direct this war. But it has positioned itself to benefit structurally and durably from every plausible ending of this war. And it has done so without expending the kind of resources that would compromise its own long-term position. That is what winning looks like in the 21st century. Not a parade, not a flag raising, not a surrender ceremony on the deck of a battleship. Winning looks like compounding advantages quietly accumulating while everyone else is paying the costs. Here is what to watch in the coming months. Watch the price of Russian crude relative to Brent, because that spread tells you exactly how much pricing power China retains over Russia. Watch the announcements coming out of Chinese drone manufacturers, because the technology transfer from the Ukrainian theater is happening in real time, regardless of how the war ends. Watch what happens to American weapons inventories in the Pacific commands, because the depletion in Europe is the inventory not available in Asia. And watch the diplomatic language coming out of Beijing toward Taipei, toward Manila, toward Tokyo, because Beijing is reading the same map you now have, and it is drawing conclusions from it. The Ukraine war will end at some point. The territorial lines will be drawn. The treaties will be signed or not signed. The headlines will move on. But the strategic transaction that has run underneath this war for 4 years will not move on. It will harden, it will compound, and the rest of the world will spend the next 20 years living inside the result. The future does not belong to the powers that fight the loudest. It belongs to the powers that read the map most accurately and position themselves before anyone else realizes what the map says. Russia versus Ukraine was the wrong question from the first week. The right question was always who is sitting on the mountain. And by the time the rest of the world figures out the answer will already be the world. That is what needed to be said. Now you know.